January, named for Janus, the god of beginnings, endings, transitions, and doorways. Janus is always two-faced, so that he's able to look backwards and forwards at the same time, future and past, asking where have we been and where are we going? We like to treat January as a clean slate, don't we? A forward-facing time for resolutions and plan making, but also it's important to look back over the year, maybe make a list of things you want to leave behind, as well as those things that you want to cultivate. Just before the Christmas holidays, I was at a dinner party with some friends where a woman asked us to go around the table and say one thing that we wanted to leave behind from 2025 and something we were looking forward to in 2026. And I always struggle with the letting go piece of this little ritual, because I hate letting things go, even things that are not good for me. But when it was my turn, something unexpected came out of my mouth, and yet it felt completely true. I said, feeling like I was that young girl who loved lima beans and didn't really want to say what was really on my mind, I said, I want to let go of the guilt for not being as much of an activist as I feel like I should be right now. Now, I have engaged in a lot of political activism in my life, especially during my years as a campus minister and then as a parish minister. When I was on Duke campus, I was part of the movement to get them to allow same-sex unions in Duke Chapel. And then as a parish minister, I went through community organizing training with the Industrial Areas Foundation, and I was instrumental in getting Justice United, their affiliate organization, started in Orange County. I have been arrested for protesting twice. I have sat down with power brokers and politicians and all kinds of people to talk about my views. And then when I left full-time ministry, I chaired the board for the UU Justice Ministries of North Carolina with the Reverend Lisa Garcia Sampson. I did that for 4 years and just recently came off the board. And so at this dinner party, this comment that I made came as a shock to me. It felt very ill-timed with everything that's going on in the world right now. I read the news. I read Heather Cox Richardson every day to get a historian's perspective about what's happening in the world currently. And then after I read those things, I always say, what can I do to help this dumpster fire? And then I start feeling guilty because my conscience, for some reason, tells me I need to take a step back for a while. The Trappist monk, Thomas Merton, once wrote, "It is my intention to make my entire life a rejection, a protest against the crimes and injustices of war and political tyranny, which threatens to destroy the whole human race and the world. I make a silent protest against the lies of politicians, propagandists, and agitators. And when I speak, it is to deny that my faith and my church can never be seriously aligned with the forces of injustice and destruction." My life then must be a protest against these things, and if I say no to these secular forces, I say yes to all that is good in the world and in humanity. Silence as protest? One's entire life as protest? This is not the way we usually think of engaging in resistance. But I've been thinking the last few weeks why my conscience is telling me to step back and what a more contemplative form of activism might look like for me. How did I get to a place where my guilt over not actively resisting caused me to own those feelings among friends that I really trust? I found myself in a place where I needed to start considering once again those important questions. Who am I? Whose am I? Who am I called to be? Queer, feminist, mother of 2 wonderful children, grandmother of 5 adorable grandchildren, friend to many people who are having some health problems, friends who are aging and need my support, a daughter of an aging mother. How am I being called right now to position my place in that milieu of people I love? And then always, how does my faith inform all of those relationships? That faith that I keep coming back to has always been rooted in Christianity. When I look at much of Christianity today, though, it's hard to claim sometimes. When I talk to leaders and members of churches, I find myself separating them into 2 categories, as much as I hate dualistic thinking. Not conservative and progressive, not conservative and liberal, as you might expect, but into categories of gospel Christians and Pauline Christians. Pauline theology is anything that comes out of St. Paul, who's responsible for much of the New Testament. The man that we know as Paul was a Jewish Pharisee who began spreading his version of what Jesus' mission had been and began building churches. In 48 AD, he started writing letters to these communities that he had founded, and in the letters, Paul lays out his plan for salvation, his idea of how those community members should treat one another, what the churches should look like, what their mission should be. But there's almost no mention of the historical Jesus in his letters. He was building churches for the Gentiles, and many people say, well, he was instrumental in spreading the gospel because he was teaching the Gentiles. But I have a slightly different take on that. He was building churches for the Gentiles because they were wealthy, learned Romans and inhabitants of Greek-speaking cities. In other words, influential people. And in many ways, Paul's mission was to describe and encourage a new faith tradition that would fit comfortably with the ruling class. Empire thinking. Paul's theology tended to serve the system, or at least not be in opposition to it. And his theology, I hazard to guess, is foundational to Christian nationalism, the kind of Christianity that embodies a nationalistic tendency. And then there's what I call gospel Christianity. Gospel Christians are those whose principles remain closely tied to the teachings of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels. These stories describe a man who had a close relationship with God, a man dedicated to faithful resistance to everything that takes away from human dignity, a man of compassion and inclusion, a man who constantly stopped on his journeys to talk to listen to, and sometimes even to heal all kinds of people who his disciples thought he shouldn't be bothering with. And he often invited to join him for dinner, which his disciples often felt was just appalling. Because in part, his mission was to help the Jewish community, which was being oppressed by Roman rule, find the emotional space where they could once again see themselves beloved and chosen. And yet he used a radical inclusion of others as his primary teaching tool. Jesus served as a light in a very dark Roman Empire for his community and sometimes for people beyond his community. And the values of gospel Christians emulate the Jesus of the gospel stories. And they are often seen as nonconformists. You know, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said one time, anytime a faith tradition serves the human condition, those people are usually going to be nonconformists. I'm paraphrasing because I didn't write his quote down, but that's the gist of it. And what I love best about Unitarian Universalism is that it's actually a very good theological fit for this gospel Christianity that I espouse. Because our principles, you know, those principles that surround the flower that has love in the middle, that's on your order of service and then describes the different kinds of ways that we bring love into the world, those are right out of the gospel stories. And they're actually consistent with all of the spiritual giants of any religious tradition. If you look at those teachings before some sort of empire got a hold of them. I suspect that many of our congregations have some closeted gospel Christians in them, even though they wouldn't call themselves that. And this is why our movement will stay smaller than most, because we try our best to stay true to the original teachings of the great spiritual masters. And that will never win you any popularity contests. We are a countercultural, resistant, nonconformist movement of love. And I hope we always remain so. I read a bumper sticker recently that said, "Jesus is coming, look busy." And I thought, what a perfect example of our grind culture, which requires the encouragement of all of us to move as fast as we can from the realities of moral, political, and environmental problems. What if being countercultural and nonconformist means to just stop for a moment and pay attention to what is happening around us? What if I were to follow my conscience, which is often the deepest form of resistance that we can take, and seriously consider that rather disturbing statement I made with my friends? In what ways would a temporary rest disrupt and push back against capitalism, white supremacy? How might a more contemplative form of activism, like that described by the monk Thomas Merton, serve me and the world at this given moment? As I sat with these questions yesterday, there were three streams of thought that came to my mind. The first was some lessons that I learned when I visited. I biked through northern Italy last October and stayed at a lot of small inns, small villages. I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of local people who, fortunately for me, spoke English. And I found it interesting that in these small towns, everything is closed on Sundays. And in many places, everything is also closed on Mondays. Can you imagine? Even in Venice, I found that most shopkeepers closed their stores for 2 to 3 hours in the afternoon and then opened them up back in the evening so that they could take some time off to do whatever kind of personal business they needed to do and then come back to work. And I thought, I love this cultural understanding that there's a natural ebb and flow between personal and private life. What would that feel like back here in the United States? I also found it interesting that on Sundays, those days tended to be for large gatherings of family and friends over a big meal that would last late into the afternoon. Sunday lunch, it was called, and it was a cultural thing that gave people a sense of place and meaning that kind of, held them for the rest of the week. And as we were sitting down to these meals, there was another thing that I found very interesting. When I get together with my friends over a meal, we talk about politics, but we also talk about what kind of diet we're on. Are we doing paleo or Mediterranean or low carb, low fat? What are we taking out of our lives in order to be good to ourselves? I never heard any of that in Italy. Instead, conversations centered around the freshness of the food, the pleasure of the company, the combinations of tastes. We have such a conflicted relationship with food here in this country, I found. Sometimes people would say, what we don't understand about Americans is why they love their salads. Or why they take all the fat out of everything. That's what keeps you full and happy. Why would you do that? And all of this has made me think again about how I spend my time, who I spend my time with, and how I derive pleasure out of life. I'm thinking also about my friends and family, how they're aging and how they are going to be needing my attention more in the future. And then lastly, how do the principles of gospel Christianity affect my decisions around these things? I remind myself that the ministry of Jesus was largely situational. In other words, rather than focusing on bringing down the systems around him, his light was focused on responding to each need as it presented itself to him. In her book, Blessing the World, What Can Save Us Now?, the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker writes, "The purpose of life is to discover the joy and well-being that simultaneously pleases us and blesses our neighbors. Every act we commit is a contribution to the world. The question is whether that action will be a blessing or a curse." Engaging in resistance always begins with our own lives as we practice speaking the truth about our own conscience, even when that's unflattering, incongruous, ill-timed. The truth that it is only through knowing and caring for ourselves that we can come to know and care for the world around us. At some point, I suspect it will be time for me to engage with the maddening world in a more public sort of resistance. And while that's too early to know what form that will take, I do know that as Unitarian Universalists, we are all called to be radical nonconformists, to be communities of resistance, to be a light in a dark world, insisting that all are welcome, all are worthy, and all belong, whatever form that may take. May it be so, and blessed be.